Hi, my name's Ali Dean, and my literature review was considering feedback and what constitutes effective feedback. To start with, I found it to be hugely contradictory. The amount of research that I was looking at, the different studies, there seemed to be, for every guideline that sort of threw up what constitutes best practice, there were so many others that seemed to contradict it. So it was quite difficult to get an overall sort of understanding of what this meant. Most of the research that I looked at was done across a huge variety of contexts, different countries, and it was for different educational levels. Some, focused on the primary context, secondary, and then tertiary sort of context. So I think the conjecture was mostly came about due to the people that were being studied, and what really became apparent was that there is just no one size fits all. You have to take the students' needs wherever they're at in their learning in their learning journeys. You need to be able to take that on board. Okay, the first principle that I identified was that effective feedback enables a student to recognise their status relative to a learning goal while providing procedural advice as to how to stay on track. From the literature, seems to be quite a bit of disagreement between which way feedback should be framed. Is it more effective when it focuses on the progress a student has made since the commencement of a learning goal, or should it instead look forward and clarify what still needs to be done towards achieving a particular learning goal? Or indeed, does the ideal model sort of lie somewhere in between? The former, it's been seen to be more in line with traditional summative assessment measures, where students receive feedback which is largely intended to highlight what the student doesn't yet know and where he or she has gone wrong. They talked within this frame, the studies that were looking at this particular type of feedback, called it either discrepancy feedback or corrective feedback. And it was basically where the feedback that was being provided was picking up the students on what they'd done wrong. But this particular type of feedback wasn't seen to be all bad, particularly in subjects like maths or physics or those types of things where immediate type of discrepancy feedback was seen to be the most effective, because those things you're dealing in sort of absolutes within those subjects, and so to be picked up on the wrong answer and given feedback immediately was seen to be more effective for the students. The other option with this is talking about progress feedback, and this is more aligned with formative means of assessment, and rather than picking up the students on where they've gone wrong, it seeks to encourage and motivate students by highlighting where they've come from in their learning journey relative to where they've started. This is really constructivist in nature, and it relies on the learner having a clear understanding of the learning goal, where they're going to, and what it will look like once they're there. There's contention here, though, as well, with the level of input. A lot of the authors believe that if it is to be constructivist in nature, then therefore students have to have had a fair bit of a say in what their actual learning goal will look like. And some authors contend that progress feedback will have less impact if they haven't actually had played a role in determining these assessment issues. I thought about this with progress feedback as an absolute model for effective feedback appears to be good in theory and provides in itself a goal towards which teachers can strive. But the reality is, I think, that while these behaviourist feedback methods are still the norm for many practicing teachers today, and even for students, really, they kind of expect sort of summative type of feedback to be provided to them. Having a big switch around and looking at a new way of providing this progress feedback is fairly unlikely. So in between, there's like a middle ground where feedback would be both backward and forward facing. And this seems like a really good idea because it's so comprehensive. I think it will be appealing to all types of learners themselves, with the way in which they will come to accept this type of feedback. But I believe that to be able to do something as comprehensive as this would be almost impossible, really, if you've got a class of 25 and you've got masses to teach within the curriculum. I just don't think teachers have enough time to be able to provide that level of detail in their feedback. So I thought this backward and forward facing model is really nice in theory, but I thought it was probably best viewed in aspirational terms. Okay, the second principle that I identified was feedback should occur as part of the daily learning process rather than just at the end of a formal assessment. I think this kind of appears obvious, and I think it's something that most teachers would probably believe that they are doing, providing ongoing specific feedback to their students as they're going in the teaching, in the classroom. But it was interesting in the studies that I looked at, while most of the teachers believed this is what they were actually doing, they were self-reporting way above what they were actually doing in class. But the interesting part with this was that students were they were almost compliant or complicit in also losing or not identifying the areas in which they could give feedback or receive feedback. So I think at the moment there's this sort of agreement going on between the teachers and the students, and everyone's sort of adhering to an old model of feedback and how it should look. I'd gone to a formative assessment conference that was led by William. Black and William are obviously fairly well known within this area of research. And I loved it. They used an analogy with this, talking about how there should be more feedback occurring in the everyday classroom. And they said to withhold feedback until the end of the unit is pointless, as it'll be too late by then for students to actually work with the results. William used a medical analogy to highlight the need for feedback, and it really should be viewed as checkups rather than post-mortems. Pointing out in doing so that they did masses of research in a meta-analysis that showed that most students largely disregard feedback that's provided at the completion of a summative assessment. So the idea is to provide it often, to provide it every day as part of the learning process. Principle 3 relates to feedback needing to be provided in a timely fashion, which seems, I think, every student or anyone that's ever been a student has always appreciated receiving feedback within an amount of time that whereby the actual assessment event is still meaningful to them after they've completed it. But it's interesting in the literature that there's a bit of conjecture about what that means, what the term timely actually means. Is it more likely to be effective if it's delivered as soon as possible after an assessment event, or is there any benefit to be had at all by the learner in there being a delay between the assessment event and when the actual feedback is provided? The consensus is that the immediate provision of feedback is required when procedural skills are being developed, like in maths, or where the ability to simply recall facts is important, so that feedback should be done straight away after that. However, when you're trying to develop a deeper conceptual understanding of pretty complex subject matter, then the research was saying that it's actually better to delay the feedback somewhat, because it's been shown that a learner is more likely to retain this knowledge that they're being developed into their long-term memory if they are forced to revisit and hone it at a later date. So it's a bit of conjecture between the two of them. I think, by and large, you can't be leaving. I think when they're talking about delayed feedback, they're not talking about like 2 weeks from one end to the other for the turnaround, but rather more like 3 or 4 days, I suppose, would be the most amount of time. Okay, the fourth principle that I identified was that feedback must be clear, honest, concise, and tailored to the individual needs of the student. There was quite a lot of interesting stuff that I sort of found within the literature with this. What was seen by a lot of studies was that the type of feedback that was being provided by teachers to their students was a bit unnecessarily complex in terms of they were using a lot of jargon and really quite difficult terms, which probably made complete sense to the teacher, but was totally leaving the students with nothing to actually work with because they didn't understand what it meant in the first place. So Brookhart comes up with a nice, easy way to remember it. When providing feedback, it's essential to remember that clear means clear to the student, which would seem sort of self-explanatory, but I think a lot of teachers still will write as they would write in terms that makes total sense to them, but not to their students. They want it to be honest, which I thought was nice. They don't need any sort of fluffy feedback that doesn't tell them exactly how they're going, obviously in the nicest way, but they want to know fairly clearly what they're doing wrong and how to improve. In terms of concise, the feedback has to be fairly short. Brookhart actually advocates for using 2 to 3 points only, or choosing 2 to 3 points to address within the feedback itself, and no more than that, because the students were, certainly if you're writing more than the students, then it's going to be that volume of information has been seen to be just way too much for them. They'll actually disregard it. And it needs to be tailored to the individual needs of the student. So let's say a lower achieving student is not likely to be particularly enthused by constantly seeing how far off the mark the student actually is. It might be that you would instead choose to talk about, that the handwriting has improved, from one task to the next, or that there was an increase or an improvement in the punctuation or the level of depth that they were able to achieve, or that type of thing. So basically taking the needs of the student into account, I think, is probably the most important thing here. How much time have they actually got to dedicate to the feedback? Is it going to be worthwhile? Are they going to gain anything from actually reading this feedback? And I think that comes down to a teacher really knowing the learning needs of their student. Right, the fifth principle that I identified was that feedback should focus on the task, not the student. And the key to this is really looking at normative assessment, and because there's such an ongoing prevalence with this, particularly with regards to NAPLAN and the HSC, there's this constant underlying sort of pressure, I guess, even amongst the students themselves, that they compare their performance relative to how they've gone relative to the other students within their class, and this has huge effects on the learning itself. In a way, by constantly sort of being compared to other students within a class, students are able to, if they're not going particularly well, they are able to start attributing, poor performances to something that's almost innate for them, and they can start to create a type of learned helplessness, which has this huge impact on the students' abilities to learn in the future. And also will have an idea, it will concrete or set an idea into a student's mind about how good they are or aren't as a learner. So feedback to be focusing on the task needs to be framed in a way that all students can come to the realisation that everyone is capable of achieving. The sixth principle that I identified was that feedback is most effective when students and teachers share a conceptual knowledge of the feedback terminology. And in a way, this relates back quite closely, or ties closely in with Principle 5. Students students are going to obviously engage or be able to engage more with feedback if they have an idea of what it means to be meeting the sort of the learning needs as desired by the teacher themselves. There's a number of studies that support the development of a shared vernacular between teachers and students when it comes to both assessment and the provision of feedback. The incongruence between what a teacher understands their students to have taken from their feedback and what the students have actually understood was highlighted as one of the main reasons for feedback being considered ineffective or completely useless by students. It was seen that students who had gained explicit instruction in what constituted a desired response in an assessment were able to engage quicker and at a much deeper level with subsequent feedback. While the time required to provide such instruction prior to an assessment event can be considerable, and in spite of the criticism that such instruction can be sometimes a bit too prescriptive, teachers could well come to regard such a time commitment as well spent. So the idea is to have an open type of forum with your students and talk about what it actually means to, what does an ideal response look like that has breadth and depth to their answer, or you might talk about the different types of terminology. What does it actually mean to analyse a text? If you are wanting an evaluation of a particular subject, then what really does an evaluation constitute? Like, what should it look like? And if you take the time to invest that sort of time with in instructing your students on that type of terminology, then later on it actually makes your feedback a little bit easier, because you won't have to write as much. You'll be able to use the type of terminology that has already that you're looking for, and the students themselves will know exactly what it means and what they have to do. What really didn't come up as much for me in the literature study, and something that I would really like to know a lot more about, there was massive conjecture about the use of grades on feedback, whether or not there's any point whatsoever in including a grade. They saw, particularly at a secondary level, that there's a tendency for particularly lower performing students to, as soon as they've seen a grade, they lock on to the grade, and anything that's been written is any other feedback that's been provided is fairly quickly discarded, and that's certainly been my experience in my school. But I've also tried going the other way and not providing grades, and nearly had anarchy on my hands from the students really needing that grade as a form of measurement, from where they've come from and to where they've been. So there's lots of conjecture there. And the other thing that I'd really like to know about is whether there's a big gender difference in how feedback is actually looked at or considered. Do boys just go for grades? Do they engage with feedback whatsoever? What about girls? Would they prefer no marks? Would they, do they prefer written feedback as opposed to oral feedback? What is is there any sort of, I would like to have seen some further guidelines, I guess, as to what constitutes best practice for providing feedback to boys and girls. On these slides, this one and the next, you'll see a list of the references that the different studies that I looked at. If you're interested in further information on this particular subject, I really recommend the references by Brookhart, by Shute, and also by Hattie and Timperley. Those ones I think I found to be very clearly written and probably the most comprehensive of all.